My name is Joey Jenkins, and this is what to expect in the life of a Navy diver. What you would be expecting is, on average, every 3 years, you're going to rotate to a different command. And every diving command out there has its own specific specialty of diving, right? What I mean by that is, say if you get orders, your first command is a MDSU, the Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit, right? You're going to go there for 3 years. What you would expect at that MDSU is this is where you're going to be experiencing everything from that heavy mixed gas, hard hat diving, rebreathers, scuba, the weapons training, the demolition training. This is one of the wider specialties of diving where you can get into a lot of things at a MDSU and experience way more than some of the other teams when it comes to just getting out there and getting busy. At a MDSU, which was one of my favorites, once you get put on your team, you would experience it's about an 18-month rotation normally, right? And on that 18-month rotation, your first 6 months, when they form up that specific team, you'll have about 6 months of what's called ULT, unit level training. In that 6 months, that's where you're going to hit all your team training to be able to, at the end of that, go through what's called a FEP, a final evaluation phase, where they're going to throw all these different scenarios at you. And you and your team actually have to go out there and operate and perform these scenarios. It's not ad lib. It's still as if you're going out overseas and making these missions happen. If you pass that unit level training after that 6 months and you pass that final evaluation phase, then your team is now a signed off deployable salvage asset, right? And then you'll go do your 6-month deployment. Usually between ULT and your deployment, you might have anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks of a little bit of downtime to kind of regroup, get some family time in, pack all your gear, and get ready for that deployment. You'll go do your 6-month deployment. During that deployment, to MDSU, you could be doing a couple different things. You could fly to a staging area, what's called like a FOB, a forward operating base, and you could be sitting in that FOB, eating a lot, working out a lot, right? Waiting for the phone to ring. If that phone rings and you get a mission that you guys have to go out and do, you'll get on that vessel of opportunity, whether it be an aircraft, a ship, a vehicle, whatever it is that you need to load up and go out and take care of that mission. Now, the other thing is at a MDSU, sometimes you might actually do that deployment on a ship. So you and your team would load up on this ship and get underway and go out on that ship. Now, sometimes on that ship, you might go to different ports in other countries and spend, roughly 2 to 3 weeks in these different areas and maybe training with these other countries, kind of waving the flag, good unit cohesion and training with the other countries. And you're still waiting for that phone to ring or whatever for a real world mission. You're just staged in that area on that vessel at that time. And if a higher priority mission comes up, you'll pull from the training missions with these other countries, so to speak, and go take care of whatever Uncle Sam says we need to go take care of. That's kind of what you're building up to for that deployment at a MDSU. Now, after you complete that deployment, you come back for about a 6-month stand down after that deployment. This is where those teams would potentially break up. Some guys that are transferring to different units or whatever, or they may be breaking up that team to build up another one for the next deployment, right? Now, after that deployment, we would also stand like a response team, right? You're still, for a certain amount of time, signed off as a fully deployable salvage asset for the government, right? Well, a lot of people don't realize is those MDSUs, those salvage teams, they also do a lot of humanitarian relief. So when you get back from that deployment, you're like in that response window. If there's a natural disaster that they need the government's assistance, say, for instance, like Hurricane Katrina was one of them, right? A lot of your civilian agencies don't have the capabilities to handle that kind of disaster response. So what happens is the government would send out a salvage asset from the Navy, and it's active duty Navy divers down there conducting this business. Another one would be like the big bridge collapse they had years ago up north. That was all Navy divers that went up there to handle that response. So there's a lot of things like that go on behind the scenes that people don't realize. It's Navy divers there doing this kind of business. That's deployment life. The MDSU, when you're home, it's again a lot of working out, a lot of training, right? A lot of training as far as diving capabilities. You're going to train doing your underwater cut and welding, your underwater demolition, your weapons training, your convoy training, your mixed gas training. Like I said, you stay very busy at a MDSU, but it is very enjoyable if you like to work hard and get after it. Another aspect of what you could expect after you graduate dive school is if you get orders to what we call an underwater ships husbandry unit. These are the guys that are out there diving on all the ships and submarines, keeping them seaworthy and out to sea instead of in dry dock, right? So when you're at a ship's husbandry team, again, you might have roughly about 15 guys on each team, right? I remember my ship's husbandry team was in good old Norfolk, Virginia, and I had a great time. That was actually my first dive locker, as we call it. So even though they're commands, we call them dive lockers. So my first dive locker, I showed up for 3 years. And when you're there, what you would expect is diving on ships and submarines just about every day. What people don't realize is that the Navy diver is out there performing some sort of repair or maintenance on these vessels. We're not out there cleaning the hulls of these vessels. That's not what we do. That kind of work is contracted out to civilian divers. What the Navy divers are doing is some sort of actual maintenance or repair on that vessel. It's usually 1, 2, maybe 3 guys at most in the water at a time. And we're doing everything from putting in like a small DC plug into a hole on a ship to stop it water from coming in, to changing the aircraft carrier propeller, right? If you think about an aircraft carrier, right, the size of a propeller on that thing, you might be changing that out, right? There's things we'd have to do. I remember doing jobs on submarines where we'd have to change the shaft bearings out, right? I know I won't get into all the technical aspect, but you're basically ripping apart the whole back end of a submarine, right? Taking the propeller off, all these things off to fix these bearings in there and then put it all back together. And then you watch that submarine pull out and go to sea. And then you sit there and think, me and my buddies just did that, right? I remember one of my first working dives in the Navy. We were rigging a propeller off of a submarine, and just me and another guy in the water hooking a crane up to a propeller to where they're going to lift this thing up out of the water. And I think we had maybe a foot of visibility if we were lucky. So you're doing very challenging things underwater, needless to say. Poor visibility most of the time. You're cold, you're wet, and you're having a great time. Because if you're not, you're doing it wrong. All right. But during that 3 years while you're at the ship's husbandry command, it's a lot of learning your surface supplied diving techniques, how to be, if you're not already mechanically inclined, how to be a good mechanically inclined person under the water, right? Because it's hard enough to do on the surface. And now you're talking about doing it underwater, right? So it's not as easy as it would think. One thing when you're at a ship's husbandry dive command is you're going to go out there and you're going to interact with people on these ships and submarines every day, right? One thing I'll tell you is if you have the idea of skipping PT in the morning to sign in the diver's tags, don't do it. Get your PT, okay? Don't ever skip PT at ship's husbandry because more than likely their tags won't be ready for you to dive anyway. A lot of camaraderie at the ship's husbandry. If you like being a mechanic and diving, that's a great place for you to go because you're going to get to do all of that in the water there at ship's husbandry. Technically, it's a shore duty billet. I think they now have some deployable billets there, and the billet just means your orders, right? But what happens is it's considered arduous shore duty, which means you're potentially working a lot because these ships and submarines require a lot of maintenance. So your home life, you may not be deploying at this kind of command, but you could very potentially be doing flyaways, right? Because these ships and submarines, if they're in a foreign port somewhere and they need these maintenance and repairs, guess who's going to go do it? The Navy divers, right? We don't want some foreign entities diving on our vessels. So we'll fly away and go do that. It's called TAD, temporary active duty, right? So they may fly you away for a couple of weeks at a time to go fix some ship or submarine in whatever port that they're in anywhere in the world. Now, another thing to think about is if you're not doing a flyaway, you might be home every night, but it's potentially longer hours during the workday fixing these ships and submarines. Something that people don't really take into consideration either is holidays, right? All of those big holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all of this kind of stuff. Well, guess what? Those ships and submarines pull in, right? So all those people can be home for the holidays. Well, guess who's there working on? The Navy divers, right? So when the holidays would hit, we would usually go into some sort of shift work, like a 12 hours on, 12 hours off, so we could get our work in on these vessels. Now, especially if we had to pull extra time during a holiday, we always got made up for somehow on the back end, right? Once the work was done, we would get early days or get, your team chief or somebody like that would give you an extra day off here and there. Something to think about in the Navy diver community is we work hard and we play hard, right? And as long as you've got good leadership, they really take care of you when it comes to all of that too. Some of the other units to think about that you might potentially get orders to out of dive school are what's called a Logsu, a logistics support unit, which supports the Navy SEALs, or an EOD ESU unit. The EOD units support the EOD guys in their training and their deployments. The Logsu support the SEALs in their training and their deployments. So although you're not necessarily on that SEAL team or that EOD platoon, you're interacting with them on a daily basis, helping them make sure they've got what they need for their training and their deployments from the diving aspect, because that's why we're there at that point, is to be that subject matter expert in all things diving to them. You may deploy with those guys, right, as that subject matter expert, to be out there in that forward operating base, that FOB, sitting there waiting to help out in any way you can from a diving related aspect. When you go out and you deploy with them, you're not necessarily out there kicking doors down with them, but you're out there in an operational capacity to be that subject matter expert when it comes to diving. When you're home, you're not going to work up with those guys necessarily for all of their training, but you may have some other specific workup training to deploy with those guys. When you're not doing anything like that for a deployment, it's basically the same at any dive unit. You're going to get your PT hours in the morning, do whatever your maintenance is on your dive gear that you have. You may go do some of your dive training or recompression chamber training, because at a Logsu or an EOD ESU unit, you're still going to be doing a lot of recompression chamber operations. You do a lot for like your recompression chamber supervisor qualifications and your inside tender qualifications, because that's a huge aspect of what the Navy diver is doing at one of those units.